My name is Sarah, and I want to tell you a story that still makes my chest tighten every time I think about it. Not because of the surgery scar that runs down my sternum, but because of the invisible wound that cut far deeper than any surgeon's knife ever could. I was 23 years old when the doctors told me I had a severe aortic valve defect, the kind that required immediate open heart surgery, or I would not survive the next few months. And I remember sitting in that cold hospital chair, staring at the white ceiling, thinking that the first people I needed to call were my parents, because no matter what had happened between us, no matter how many times my mother had looked at me like I was a burden she never asked for, or how many times my father had chosen silence over support, they were still my parents, and surely, this would be the moment they would show up for me. I had grown up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, a nice neighborhood, a well-kept lawn, family photos on the wall that showed smiling faces hiding 1,000 unspoken tensions. My mother was a woman who cared deeply about appearances and very little about feelings. She wanted a daughter who was obedient, quiet, grateful. And when I grew into someone who had opinions and dreams and a voice she did not approve of, she began to treat me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And my father, God. My father was the kind of man who loved peace more than he loved truth. He never stood up for me, not once, not when my mother criticized everything I did, not when she told me at 18 that I should be thankful they even let me live in their house. Not when I cried myself to sleep because I could not understand what I had done to deserve a love that felt so conditional, so fragile, so exhausting. By the time I was 21, I had moved out, found a small apartment, worked 2 jobs, put myself through college, and built a quiet life that was mine. And even then, I tried to maintain a relationship with them, calling every Sunday, visiting on holidays, bringing gifts I could barely afford, hoping that one day something would shift, that they would look at me and finally see me, really see me, but that day never came. And then the diagnosis arrived, and I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the thing that will finally make them understand that I need them. I called my mother first, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I told her everything the doctor said. I told her the surgery date. I told her I was scared. And there was a pause on the line so long that I thought the call had dropped. And then she said, "Sarah, you know we have the Hendersons' anniversary party that weekend. I really don't think we can make it." And I sat there holding the phone, feeling like the floor had opened beneath me. I said, "Mom, I'm having open heart surgery." And she said, "I know. But you're young, you'll be fine. The doctors will take care of you." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. She moved on to asking if I had seen her Facebook post about her garden. And I said yes, I had, and I hung up and I sat in silence for a very long time. I called my father next, and he listened. He really listened. And for one brief moment, I felt hope flicker in my chest. And then he said, "You know how your mother is, Sarah. I can't come without her. You understand?" And I said yes, I understood, and I did understand. I understood everything in that moment with a horrible crystal clarity that I had been spending years trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. The surgery was on a Tuesday morning in October. The leaves outside the hospital window were turning red and gold, and I checked myself in alone, signed my own consent forms alone, answered the nurse's question about emergency contacts with a pause that made her look up from her clipboard with soft, concerned eyes, and I gave her my friend Maya's number because Maya, who had known me for only 2 years, had taken 3 days off work to be there, had held my hand in the waiting room, had brought me a blanket from home because she knew hospital blankets were thin. And as they wheeled me into the operating room and the anesthesia began to pull me under, the last thought I had was not about my parents. It was about how strange and painful and beautiful it was that the people who were supposed to love you the most could fail you so completely, while near strangers held your hand in the dark. And when I woke up 6 hours later with a tube down my throat and a pain in my chest that felt like the world was sitting on it, the first face I saw was Maya's. Red-eyed and exhausted and smiling with relief. And I cried, not just because I had survived, but because in that sterile white room, I finally understood something I had been refusing to accept for years, that my parents were never going to be who I needed them to be, and that the life I was going to build from this moment forward was going to be built on real love, chosen love, the kind that shows up without being asked, the kind that takes days off work and brings blankets from home. And as I lay there in recovery, broken and healing all at once, I made myself a quiet promise that I was going to stop begging for a seat at a table that was never set for me, and I was going to build my own table instead. And it was going to be filled with people who actually deserved to sit at it. The years that followed my surgery were not easy, but they were mine, entirely and unapologetically mine. I threw myself into recovery with a determination that surprised even my doctors, and once my body healed, I poured every ounce of energy I had into my work. I had been designing websites as a freelancer before the surgery, but now I turned it into something bigger. I started my own digital marketing agency from my tiny apartment with nothing but a laptop, a Wi-Fi connection, and a fury that burned so quietly inside me that most people mistook it for ambition. And maybe it was ambition, but underneath it was something darker, something sharper. It was the need to prove that I could thrive without the people who were supposed to be my foundation. And thrive I did. Within the first year, I had 10 clients. Within the second year, I had an office. Within the third year, I had a team of 12 people working under me. And by the time 5 years had passed since that Tuesday morning in October, when I lay on an operating table with no family by my side, I was living in a beautiful apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I had money in my bank account. I had respect in my industry. I had Maya, who was now my best friend and business partner. I had a man named Daniel who loved me in a way I never thought I deserved, who held me on the nights when the scar on my chest ached and the scar inside me ached even more. And I had peace, real, genuine, hard-earned peace. The kind you only get when you stop waiting for people to love you and start loving yourself so fiercely that their absence becomes background noise instead of the main event. I had not spoken to my parents in 5 years. Not a single call, not a single text, not a single holiday card, and I had made that choice deliberately and painfully. I had grieved them like they had died, because, in a way, the parents I had always wanted them to be had never existed in the first place. And then one evening in November, 5 years and 1 month after my surgery, I was cooking dinner with Daniel in our kitchen, music playing softly, the apartment warm and golden with light, and the doorbell rang. And when I opened the door, I saw two people I almost did not recognize. My mother looked 10 years older than she should have. Her hair was thinner, her face was drawn, her eyes were red and swollen. And my father stood behind her looking smaller than I had ever seen him, like the world had finally pressed down on him, the way he had let it press down on me for years. And my mother opened her mouth and said, "Sarah, please." And I stood there in the doorway of the life I had built without them, and I felt everything at once. Rage and grief and satisfaction and sadness, all crashing together like waves in a storm, and I did not invite them in. I stood right there in that doorway and I said, "Why are you here?" And my father spoke first, his voice cracking. He said they had lost everything, their investments had failed, their house was in foreclosure. They had been living with my uncle for 6 months, but he had asked them to leave. And my mother, the same woman who could not miss a party to be at her daughter's heart surgery, looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "You're all we have left, Sarah." And I want to tell you that in that moment I felt nothing, that my heart was cold and my mind was clear. But that would be a lie, because the little girl inside me, who had spent her whole childhood begging for their attention, wanted to open that door wide and let them in and finally have the family she always dreamed of. But I was not that little girl anymore. I was a woman who had signed her own surgery consent forms, who had built a company from nothing, who had learned that love is not something you chase. It is something that chases you when it is real. And so I looked at my mother and I said, "You had me, you always had me. You had me when I was a little girl who wanted nothing more than your approval. You had me when I was a teenager crying in my room. You had me when I called you from a hospital telling you I might die. And every single time you chose something else over me, a party, your comfort, your pride, and now that everything else is gone. Now I'm all you have left, but the truth is, Mom, you lost me a long time before tonight." And my mother collapsed into sobs, and my father reached for my hand, and I stepped back. Not out of cruelty, but out of self preservation. Because I had spent 5 years building a life where I did not need to beg for love, and I was not going to let anyone, not even the people who gave me life, drag me back into that desperate, hopeless cycle again. And I told them I would help them financially because I was not heartless. I would make sure they had a place to live and food to eat because that was the kind of person I had chosen to become. But I would not give them access to my heart again, not the way they wanted, not the way they had wasted before. And as I closed the door and walked back into my warm, golden apartment where Daniel was waiting with quiet, steady love in his eyes, I felt the strangest thing. I did not feel victory. I did not feel revenge. I felt free, truly completely free, because the greatest revenge is not making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. The greatest revenge is building a life so full of love and purpose and peace that their absence becomes the smallest footnote in a story that turned out to be extraordinary. And my story. The story of the girl who almost died alone on an operating table was no longer about them. It was about me. It had always been about me, and I was finally the one telling it.